Welcome back, Doomtown fans. Willingdon here, and I'm back again to review Faith and Fear. In this video, we're going to be looking at all of the non-dude cards in the box. We're going to kick things off with a deed, and the first one we have is Pettigrew's Pawn Shop. This is a 2 of diamonds. It's worth a control point. It's 3 to play with 1 income. Private. After a player plays a non-gadget goods, this deed's controller gains a ghost rock. I'm a little bit mixed on this card. On one hand, I think that it could make you a little bit of money against basically every deck, since essentially every deck plays some number of goods cards. There's very few exceptions to that. But at the same time, the non-gadget restriction is going to be a pretty big deal because it's going to be a lot harder to make your own deck based around using this thing. Now, in the past, I had talked a little bit about a horse-oriented strategy that played a lot of horses and other goods. Maybe this could fit into that pretty well, but I think for the most part, this card is really only going to fit into your deck if you're looking for another 2 of diamonds and Gomorrah Parish isn't enough for you. I think maybe this has some limited playability. I don't think it's totally awful, but I'm not exactly excited about this card. Next up, we have one of my picks for the biggest bombs in the box. This is California Tax Office. It's a Jack of Diamonds. It's worth a control point. It's 2 to play with 1 income. Private government, and it comes into play booted. That's interesting. I'd like to see more of that. Controller Noon Boot. Choose another player's dude. The dude's controller either pays the dude's upkeep or discards the dude. Reduce the dude's upkeep to 0 until after the next upkeep phase. There's a lot of cool things going on with this card, so let's try to go through them one by one. First of all, why would you want to use its Noon Boot ability? Well, the biggest thing that I'm seeing is Stephen Wiles. There's a variety of other guys, but I think Stephen Wiles is case in point why this card is good. If a dude has a huge upkeep, this card is going to make him a huge liability on the board, and it's just so easy to use this card to deal with Stephen Wiles. Now, you could also use this against a higher-end dude that's more like a dude that they're planning on having stick around that has like 2 or 3 upkeep, and that's still going to be a pain in the butt because they're going to have to spend it right then, and it's going to prevent them maybe from playing deeds or developing their economy the way they'd like to, or some things like that. In addition to the good Noon Boot effect, the card is cheap to play for 2, and it's worth the control point and you still get the income, so its stats are really strong. It's also a Jack of Diamonds, which fits pretty well into Dead Man's Hand, as well as maybe some other draw structures. And I'm really saying Dead Man's Hand because this is also a government deed, which interacts well with Rafi Hamid in the Law Dogs faction. So, in general, I think that this is going to immediately start seeing play. It's amazing against Stephen Wiles, who is easily the most played dude in the game. And I really just like the idea in general that there's a way to deal with Stephen Wiles. I've been kind of frustrated with Stephen Wiles. I think a lot of people have. There's just so many decks where you're going to play, 4 Stephen Wiles, 3 Stephen Wiles, a lot of Stephen Wiles. And there's just a huge number of combats in the game where it's like Stephen Wiles versus Stephen Wiles and maybe like one other guy. And having something like this in the game to make it a more of a liability to include Stephen Wiles is just excellent. I really, really like the design of this deed. I think this is something that the game is really needed, and I think is going to encourage more diverse deck building, and it's going to improve one of my favorite decks, which is Dead Man's Law Dog. Next up, we have St. Anthony's Chapel. This is a Queen of Diamonds. It's worth a control point. It's 2 to play with 1 income. Private Holy Ground.
Abominations at this location get -1 bullets. The controller's dudes get +1 to their skill ratings while at this deed.
Well, here's another cheap deed with a pretty good effect. Still worth the control point, still getting the income. And I think that +1 to skill ratings is going to be really appealing in a ton of decks. It's also a high value at Queen, so I think that this is going to be an auto include in a few decks. A lot of spell-oriented decks are probably going to want this. If you're doing something with Mad Scientist, you're probably going to want this. I think pretty much if you're able to capitalize on the +1 skill check thing, you're going to want this in your deck. It's just such a solid all-around deed. I really just like seeing something like this in the game. And the Abomination thing, I guess, is kind of interesting. Could be maybe useful in certain situations. But really, for me, it seems like that +1 skill rating thing is the best part of this card.
The next deed should make anyone who is familiar with original Doomtown smile. This is the Whately Estate. It is a King of Diamonds, 2 control points. It's 4 to play, and it's 0 income. Private, dudes not controlled by this deed's owner boot after moving there. Controller noon boot, move a non-dude card from your boot hill to your discard pile. Well, everyone's favorite spooky family from original Doomtown is back, and in the form of this estate. Now, this card, I think, is probably going to be pretty clumsy to use for a huge majority of decks, but it's got a lot of cool, unprecedented things going on. First of all, it's really cheap to get 2 control points. And the fact that it has a protective ability in that dudes who move there, even if you don't control it, those dudes are going to have to boot when they get there. That's going to make it a lot easier to call them out or do nasty things to them with spells, things like that. Now, this noon boot ability that's going to get a non-dude card from boot hill to your discard pile, well, that's kind of weird to use, right? Now, there's a couple good spells that we're going to get back. Raising Hell is a pretty good example. That's going to give us a way to get abominations from boot hill. Also, Ace in the Hole might be kind of useful with this as well. Another thing I had thought of is that if we're using Slay Liebody's ability to repull, we might ace some spells. It might be nice to get those back. So I do think that there's a few ways to use this ability, even if the ability is kind of strange and pretty limited in use. I think in general, this is just going to be a high value deed that's going to be a high value pull in your deck, worth 2 control points, cheap to play, no income, but the cheap 2 control points is really strong, especially with a protective ability attached to it. Now we're getting to the goods cards in the pack. And the first one we have is Outlaw Mask. This is an Ace of Hearts. It's 1 to play. It's Attire. That's a new one. While in the town square, this dude gets a bonus to their influence equal to their bounty. At first glance, this card is maybe a little underwhelming, but I do think that this is going to have some playability. As both the title and the artwork would suggest, I think probably Sloan Gang is going to benefit the most from this, as we see an emerging Sloan Gang archetype that's focused on gaining lots of bounties. I like this card a lot because Sloan Gang has had a lot of issues with having enough influence, and in general, their dudes are very low influence, so they have a lot of trouble playing down enough of them to really keep up with some of the control point generation, especially of Morgan and some other decks. This could potentially be a big shot in the arm of influence to prevent yourself from losing and to just give yourself a little bit more play, especially since you're probably going to control the town square anyway. So I see this as being a way for the Sloan Gang to buy themselves a little bit of time as they gear up and establish control of town square, maybe play a few jobs, and just generally develop their dudes and the equipment of those dudes and things like that.
Next up, we have another goods card. This is Clown Carriage. It is a Jack of Hearts. It's 2 to play. It's mystical, a horse, a gadget, and it has difficulty 8. It has React Boot. When forming or joining a posse, this dude and unbooted abominations at this dude location do not have to boot to join the posse. And then it also has Shootout Boot, play an abomination from your hand into your posse. Well, this seems like a pretty obvious choice for the Oddities of Nature deck. I think that this has a lot of playability if you're actually playing enough abominations for this to really do anything. So I think for the most part, this is only going to be in the 4th ring decks that are very heavily focused on the abominations. But in those decks, it's going to give us a lot of tricks. Now, the gadget aspect is going to make it a little bit difficult. But if you'll recall, we saw Valeria Botten in the last part of the review. She's pretty much exactly what we need to be able to do something like this. Now, difficulty 8, that's going to be pretty high. But if you're already playing a deck with spells and you're probably going to have to skew your deck towards high pulls anyway, I can see this having some limited playability. It's going to be awkward to use. It's going to require a certain amount of deck building around it. But the payoff seems really strong, especially that second ability that lets you just drop abominations into a shootout. That's potentially really scary to face down as your opponent, not knowing what you have access to in your hand. Next up, we have BioCharge Neutralizer. This is another goods card. It's a Queen of Hearts, 2 to play. It gives +2 bullets. Weapon, gadget, difficulty 9. This dude is a stud. This card cannot be traded and is not affected by other players' card effects. I'm not really sure how to feel about this card. In general, the way that I've been playing with gadgets is I use a mad scientist to invent him and then trade it off to a guy that is more disposable or a guy I actually want to fight with. You can't do that with this card. Maybe this could have some usability with Zoe that we saw in the previous part of the review, but in general, I'm a little apprehensive about the idea that you can't trade this thing. Now that said, the 2 cost and the high pull value for the +2 bullets and the stud seems like a pretty good value. I don't know, I think that this has some limited playability, especially in an aggressive gadget-oriented deck, but it is going to be a little clumsy to use. Next up, we have Evanor. This is a King of Hearts. It's 4 to play, and it's +3 bullets. It's unique, mystical, a weapon, and it's melee. That's a new one. If there is an unbooted non-melee weapon in the opposing posse, this goods provides no bullet bonus. And then it has Shootout Boot. If this dude is blessed, they cannot be a casualty in the next round of the shootout. If you win this round, the loser takes an additional casualty. Well, here's an extremely powerful goods card that's both expensive and I think a little cumbersome, but it's certainly worth the payout. That Shootout Boot ability is really, really strong if you can actually fight 2 rounds of a combat, and it's especially good if you actually win the first round and don't take any casualties. That additional casualty is really brutal. It's so hard to do that with basically anything except like Flamethrower and maybe a handful of other effects. So that's going to be really strong. Now, the unbooted non-melee weapon in the opposing posse, that seems like it's going to happen a reasonable amount of times. But a lot of the weapons goods have some sort of boot effect. So it's very possible that in the second round of the combat, you will actually get the bullet bonus. I don't know. I think that this is really strong. I think it makes sense if you have blessed dudes in your team and you're actually able to capitalize on that shootout effect. The +3 bullets is really, really good, and the king value isn't going to be competing with a lot of cards, and it's going to be a really nice pull if you need that sort of thing in your deck, which you probably will if you're playing blessed dudes. So I think this is probably a good choice for the blessed strategies, probably Law Dogs. Next up, we have the first spell of the box,
But this one's a hex. It's mirror, mirror, 2 of hearts, 1 to play. Shootout hex 4 boot. This huckster's bullet type becomes that of an opposing dude. If this huckster has a lower bullet rating, they gain a bullet bonus equal to the difference in ratings. It also has shootout hex boot. An opposing dude's bullet type becomes that of this huckster. If the huckster has a lower bullet rating, the dude suffers a bullet penalty equal to the difference in ratings. Well, I think it's fair to say that the best part of this is the second of the 2 shootout abilities, where you're able to make your opposing dude equal to the both bullet type and bullet rating of your huckster. Most of the time, your huckster is going to suck at combat, and he probably isn't a stud. Mika is a stud, but I think in general, you're not going to have a lot of studs. So in general, I see this as being a way to neuter an opposing dude who has a lot of stud bullets. That's something a lot of the spell-oriented decks can kind of use, but I think in general, we kind of have a lot of effects that are similar to this. Ways to boot the dude, ways to move the dude home, ways to mess around with the dude, even control the dude if we're talking about puppet. So, I don't know. I think maybe this could see some play. I think if you're going to be playing this, it's probably going to be because it's a 2 value. I don't see the effect of this hex as being really that strong, but maybe if you had a good way to use the first part of it, where giving your huckster a bunch of bullets was somehow beneficial, that could be pretty strong. I don't know. I'm iffy on this spell. I like that we have a spell in this 2 of hearts range, and I like the fact that we're getting a few more kind of interesting hexes, but I think the hex market is already very crowded for most 4th ring decks, and I'm not sure this is going to make the cut for an overwhelming majority of them, just because of that low pull value and the fact that the hex effect is not totally game breaking. I think I'm most inclined to mess with this card in Sloan huckster decks, because I think they can make the best advantage out of the first part of the ability, where they're able to gain maybe some bullets of the opposing dude. Well, here it is. We've come to the first miracle. This is Lay on Hands. It's a 4 of hearts, 1 to play. React Miracle 8, boot. When another dude at this or an adjacent location is being discarded as a casualty or aced, boot this dude. Send that dude home booted instead. That dude will not unboot during the sundown phase at the end of this turn. Miracle 8, that's a pretty high value. That's going to be pretty hard to pull with a lot of dudes that are in the blessed like 0 to 2 range. But that ability that you get from it is really good, especially since it affects adjacent locations. So the guy who is using this doesn't even have to be in the fight or near the fight. He can just be off to the side and use this ability. This reminds me of Arnold, but it's kind of good Arnold, super good Arnold, I guess. It is going to be a lot harder to use than Arnold. Obviously, you have to have a blessed dude. You're going to have to be able to pull high. But this ability is really strong. It lets you ablate so much damage from a fight. Your dude is getting aced, and you can just, react and save him. That seems to be something that you could really combine with a lot of different cards. Anything that aces your dude, you're going to be able to potentially save the dude and send him home booted instead. The next miracle is called Holy Roller. This is a 6 of hearts. It's 0 to play. It's a miracle. Shootout Miracle 6. Boot. This blessed gains +1 bullets and cannot be chosen as a casualty during this round of the shootout, unless you lose by 3 or more ranks. This seems like a pretty good effect. The +1 bullets is nice, but the anti-casualty effect is really, really good, especially if you have a deck that can make some reasonably decent hands like a full house pretty regularly. This seems like a way to prevent yourself from taking a lot of damage, especially in one-on-one fights where your blessed dude is the target of the attack. I also really like that this is a 6 of hearts, so it's going to meet a lot of the pull requirements of other spells that we might play in the deck, as long as we don't play a ton of miracles with really, really high values and we have a miracle guy with like bless 2 or so. The next miracle is probably my favorite. This is The Lord Provides. It is an 8 of hearts. It's 2 to play. Shootout Miracle 9. Boot. Boot this blessed to search your deck and or discard pile for an action card, reveal it, and place it in your hand. Discard this spell. Well, here we have an action tutor, and that's going to be really good just because there's a million amazing actions, especially that you can play during a shootout. Now, you wouldn't necessarily have to play it during the shootout, but I think for the most part, you're going to be using this card to tutor up one of your bomb shootout events, and you're not going to have to play too many of those in your deck if you're playing something like this to go find it. That seems pretty good to me. 8 of hearts is a great value. It's right in the middle. It's high enough that you're going to be able to pull high with it when you need to. It's going to fit into a lot of draw structures because it's at that 8 value. In general, I think this is going to be a really, really solid miracle. You do have to discard it when you use it. I see that maybe as being a liability. It's also a bit expensive to put into play at 2, but I think that tutor effect is going to be worth it in a huge majority of situations, just because you're going to be able to get some bomb thing out of the deck, and it could potentially really change the tide of a fight. This is a really cool design. I really like this, and I like that it's this powerful tutor effect attached to a kind of difficult to use spell. The next spell is actually a hex. This is Phantasm. It is a 9 of hearts. It's 1 to play. Noon Hex 9 Boot. Choose another player's unbooted dude at this or an adjacent location. Move them to a location adjacent to where they are now. And then it also has Noon Hex 12 Boot. Move another player's booted dude at this location to an adjacent location. Here's yet another good option for the high-end huckster decks, probably based around 4th ring. Man, you can do some cool stuff with this. I really like that second ability. I know it's Hex 12, which is going to be reasonably hard to do, but moving booted dudes around is going to be super good, especially if we're talking about at their home or some other locations where they might be safe. Suddenly you can move them into like the town square or just another location where it's not nearly as safe. This is a really powerful spell. It does have some really high pull values required, so I think we're probably going to be seeing this mainly in the really heavy huckster decks, like the 4th ring decks, but I think it's probably going to be worth including 1 or 2 of this in those decks. It's got a high value, it's going to pull well, and it's got 2 really good abilities that are going to allow you to do some kind of funky movement rule breaking stuff. This seems really good. I think this is probably going to see immediate play in the 4th ring decks that have already been popular, and I think we might see it in a few other decks as well, but I think I'm going to be trying this right away in the 4th ring deck. The next miracle is Walk the Path. This is a 10 of hearts. It's 0 to play. Noon Miracle 6 Boot. Move one of your dudes to this blessed location. Shootout Miracle 7 Boot. One of your dudes in any location joins this blessed posse. Unboot that dude. Well, this is like the Shadow Walk for miracles, and it's really strong just like Shadow Walk. Instead of allowing the blessed dude to move around a lot, this is going to allow other dudes to join the blessed dude really easily, either at noon timing or at shootout timing. but the shootout ability is particularly strong because of the unboot the dude ability. That's really, really good. Being able to reuse one of your guys, either using some of his boot ability that he didn't get the ability to use earlier, or just having him unbooted so that he can do something else that turn, like move around, is really, really good. I really like this design. I think this is going to be pretty easy to use. The pull values are low-ish. I mean, they're low enough that you're going to make them a huge majority of the time. And this is a 10 of hearts, so it itself is going to be a pretty good pull value. I think if you're going to be playing a miracle-oriented deck, this is just a staple that you're absolutely going to want to play. This is really, really solid, and I really like the design of this card. The next spell that we have is a miracle. It's called Soothe. It's a Queen of Hearts. It's 1 to play. Noon Miracle 10 boot. Boot this blessed to unboot another dude at this or an adjacent location. If you're able to make a pull of 10 on this thing in your blessed deck, which I think you're reasonably going to be able to do, this is pretty much a staple. It's a high value, and it's got such a utilitarian, useful ability. You're going to be able to accomplish a lot of tasks with this card. And like with what we've been seeing with some of these other miracles, this is mainly about having blessed guys synergize with other guys that are in your group. So you're going to potentially be able to unboot your main fighter, going to be able to unboot some guy who had to boot to move somewhere. There's just so many useful things you can do with this. Can really come out as a surprise if you play this thing and then are suddenly able to unboot a dude. I think all around this is definitely a staple if you're having a miracle-oriented deck. The last few cards in the box are all action cards, and we're going to start things with Swinford Finds Trouble. It's a 4 of clubs, 0 to play, shootout, boot 1 or more dudes in your posse. As you boot each dude, choose a dude in the opposing posse with a lower bullet rating. Boot the chosen dude or send them home if they are already booted. I really like the ability to send home a dude who is already booted. I think that has a lot of defensive applications as well as offensive applications. The thing that really distinguishes this from a pistol whip or another send a guy home effect is the fact that this could potentially affect several dudes. This could be a real tide turner in a large fight where like 2 to 4 guys are getting into a battle. I really think this ability to affect more than one guy is where this card shines, but the fact is that this card is going to be pretty clumsy to use in quite a few decks. You're not only going to have an unbooted dude, at least one, but that dude is also going to have a high enough bullet rating to be able to surpass the other dude that you're trying to either boot or send home. Now that's pretty doable in a few factions. I think that it's especially doable in Law Dogs when you have access to Prescott Utter, but I could see it being useful in like Sloan Gang or maybe even in certain Morgan Cattle Company builds. In general, I think that you're going to have to already have a set of dudes that have fairly high bullet values, especially more than one guy that has a bullet rating over 1. Like if you start with multiple guys that have 2+ bullets, I could see this being pretty good. I think if you had a lot of dudes that you're planning on deploying throughout the game that had very high bullet ratings, this seems to work pretty well with Stephen Wiles or something like that. I don't know, I think that this card is a little weird to use, but the effect is definitely worth it, and I certainly think at the 4 value, this is going to contest Coach Whip in a few decks, especially decks that are looking to be a little more offensive while still having a card that could defend them against some like dangerous jobs or things like that. The next action is Under the Weather. This is a 5 of clubs, it's 0 to play. Noon, choose a dude and pull. If the pull equals or exceeds their grit, boot them. If it exceeds their grit by 6 or more, send them home booted. Well, here's another interesting disabling effect at 5 of clubs. I kind of like this. This is another very value-oriented way to deal with dudes. I've talked a lot about these value-oriented effects in the past when I've been talking about things like Shotgun, but this card I think has a lot more usability. It doesn't require quite the level of deck building and restriction that you would with something like Shotgun. This, you're just going to have to pull high. And I think that there's quite a few decks that can pull at, 10 plus pretty easily, especially decks that are casting spells. This card seems pretty interesting to me in those decks. While itself being a 5, it is going to be a bit of a limitation. This could potentially be pretty brutal against opposing spellcasting dudes. I'm thinking Mika Rice really gets annihilated by this thing. It's going to be pretty easy to hit him with this and send him home booted. If you're playing a deck that can pull high, I feel like this is at least something to consider. Probably not as a full 4 of, but maybe as like a 2 of or something like that to maybe complement Pistol Whip. The nice thing about this card, as opposed to something like Pistol Whip, is that it can hit a dude anywhere. So you're not going to have to be in a shootout with the dude like you would with Pistol Whip. You're not going to have to be adjacent to the dude like you would with a lot of the spells. You're just going to choose a dude and you're going to pull, and hopefully you're going to pull a number high enough to boot him or send him home booted. This is pretty decent. I think that this has a fair amount of playability, and it's really scary against those low value, low grit dudes, especially some of the spellcasters that we see used pretty extensively. It's also really good against a lot of the influence type dudes that we've been seeing on and off. Things like Jake Smiley, things like Clementine Lepp, just dudes that are low value and have some sort of influence effect that's the main reason they're in your posse. The next action is Faster on the Draw. This is a 6 of clubs. It's 0 to play. Shootout, your dude gets +1 bullets. If they are a deputy, they become a stud. One opposing dude gets -2 bullets. Right away with this thing, we're thinking Law Dogs. The deputy bonus is pretty nice, although if you actually look at the list of deputies, most of them are stud, at least currently in the game. Probably the best one to convert from draw to stud is Rafi Hamid. And I think if you were playing like the government deed focused stuff, this card could make a lot of sense with him. Since he's a 2 draw, you could convert him into a 3 stud by playing this card. So that seems pretty good. The -2 bullets seems pretty decent. This card's really going to be nice in a one-on-one scenario, making the opposing dude really, really weak and hopefully making your guy in the 2 or 3 stud range. I think that this card's pretty nice to have access to at 6. The no cost, this is just another decent shootout effect that I think a lot of Law Dogs decks are going to consider. I don't necessarily see the 6 being an incredible value in a lot of those decks. There might be some straights or some straight flush type stuff you could do, but I think in general 6 is probably going to be off value. But just having more decent shootout effects for the options when it comes to deck building is going to be really nice. And that deputy bonus is kind of icing on the cake to an overall pretty decent shootout effect. The next action that we have is This'll Hurt in the Morning. It is an 8 of clubs, 0 to play. Cheat and resolution, choose and discard 1 or 2 cards in an opponent's illegal hand. Replace them with cards drawn from the top of their owner's deck. If your hand is legal, then for each card discarded, your opponent must either pay you a Ghost Rock or ace the card. This cheatin' ability is really cool, but I'm a little underwhelmed with it. I see that it's going to be able to seriously disrupt an illegal hand, especially like the illegal hands that we're most worried about, things like 5 of a kind and 4 of a kind even. I think it's going to be pretty easy to mess those hands up by making them redraw 1 or 2 cards. And the added bonus of those cards maybe being aced is kind of nice. It's going to slow down their ability to make those 4 and 5 of a kinds in the future. but I don't think that this is going to be as versatile as some of the other cheat and punishers, even if it is stronger in terms of power level. I think you're really going to have to consider, would you rather have something like Coach Whip or even maybe Cheat and Varmint over this if you're just looking for a cheat and punisher effect? Now, I do like that this is at 8. The 8 of clubs slot is kind of all or nothing with most decks. I think you either want to play like 4 of a particular card like Bounty Hunter in that slot, or you don't necessarily have a lot to play at 8, but it might fit into your draw structure. I don't know, I think this is an interesting option. I like having more cheat and punishers in the game, especially at different values. So I think in general I welcome this card. I just am not immediately impressed with it. The next action is Prayer. This is a 9 of clubs, is 0 to play. Noon. Choose one of your dudes who can attach miracles as a shootout play and at any location. If the dude is not blessed, they gain blessed 0, but must discard attached miracles after sundown. This card's going to allow us to temporarily make one of our guys a blessed dude, and therefore able to cast miracles. And at the same time, it's going to allow us to attach those miracles in a shootout and at any location. It seems to me like the most powerful thing that we can do with this card is attach our miracles at kind of an instant speed is as a surprise in the middle of a shootout. But I don't know, in general, I don't really think that this is going to be that great. I think maybe there's some ways to use it within the miracle decks. I don't think you're really going to include this in a deck that's like not using a lot of miracles and only plays a couple of them. That seems kind of awkward to me. I don't know. I'm going to reserve judgment on this card. I don't really see it being that great, but maybe there's some uses of this I haven't thought of. The next action is Meet the New Boss. This is a Jack of clubs. It's 1 to play. Noon job, mark the town square. If successful, your leader permanently gains 1 influence and 1 control point. Ace this card whether or not the job succeeds. Holy cow, this card is really cool. I really like this card. We already have a good job at Jack, but man, this thing is really strong as an option, especially for like Sloan, maybe for some of the spell-oriented decks. Just having access to a really powerful job that focuses on the town square is going to be really cool. We already have some of those. Like I just mentioned, the coach comes to town. That's already pretty decent. But I think that if you're looking for a job that has a really big impact in the game, this is definitely going to be a bigger deal, I would say, than a coach comes to town. This card's really awesome. I love the ability to give permanent influence and control to the leader of the job. That gives you a lot of flexibility. I also really like that the mark is the town square, because that's going to let the more aggressive decks leverage this sort of thing. I see this being pretty good in either a deck that's using casters and therefore can have the caster be the leader and really difficult to oppose in the town square, or also something like Sloan or maybe Law Dogs, where you're able to just brute force the town square with really aggressive dudes, and you're looking to use this job to gain an extra control point and a little more influence. Man, this card's cool. This is definitely one of my favorite jobs in the game, and I expect this card to be pretty good in a fairly wide range of decks. Well, folks, sadly that brings us to the end of Faith and Fear. Like I said in the first part of the review, I think that this box has done a lot of really good things for the game. It's added a lot of breadth to the existing strategies. It's made a lot more of your choices less automatic and has made you have to focus and nuance your builds a lot more. I think in general this is going to address some of the problems I was having with the game, where a lot of deck lists were kind of samey
and a lot of strategies were sort of predefined, and there were certain strategies, especially the gadget strategy, that just couldn't really swing it with the other strategies. I think they've done a lot to address these things. I think the miracles are a good addition to the game. I think that there's a lot of interesting things going on in this box, and I'm really excited to see what happens next with the metagame of this game, what types of decks rise to the top. I think it's definitely going to be an open field now that we got such a wide array of options. I have to admit that I'm kind of surprised at how open the design of this box is. I assumed that it was going to be very specialized, that it was going to be really, really focused on the miracles and stuff, and instead we got a good chunk of stuff for that, but instead we also saw a lot of other cards for existing strategies. And I think that was a good choice on the part of the designers, because it's really helped some of the areas of the game that I think needed some more fleshing out. I also think that's going to make it easier for new players later on, because this box is going to be such a concentrated lot of really good stuff. It's going to be a lot easier to start a collection with just a couple core sets and this box and potentially some of these other big boxes we see in the future. I think that's going to make it a lot easier for new players to get into the game. Well, I hope you liked this review, and if you did, please click the subscribe button and the button that looks like a thumbs up, and I'll see you again for some more Doomtown stuff.